Okay, so I should start?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hello, good day, everyone. My name is Mark Dalton, and I'm a nuclear physicist, but today we're going to be talking about nothing related to nuclear physics. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Brian Moritz, who is a senior lecturer at the University of the Western Cape. So I've known Brian for a very long time. I went to university at the University of the Witwatersrand, which is the biggest and oldest university in Johannesburg in South Africa. And that's where we met. And that's where Brian did all of his studies. And we spent a lot of time together in the Exploration Society there, doing whitewater rafting and going out into the bush and seeing the beautiful nature that is available in South Africa. So Brian has a PhD, and following that, he spent some time at Cornell University as a postdoctoral fellow, and then he is now at the Department of Biodiversity and Conservation Biology at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. And today he's going to tell us about snake feeding ecology and how and why we study the diets of snakes. So Brian, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark. Hi, everybody. This is the first time I'm giving a lecture kind of this sort to an audience that I think is going to be as diverse as this one is likely to be. And so really what I'm going to do is mostly tell you about some of the research that takes place in my lab at the University of the Western Cape. And it's going to include some technical stuff, but I've also made sure to remove some of the technical stuff that's just unnecessary and focus more on some of the stories and mostly some of the amazing animals and biology that we get to work with here. So as Mark said, I'm at the University of the Western Cape in the Department of Biodiversity and Conservation Biology. And my lab group studies snake feeding ecology, or many facets of snake biology, but snake feeding ecology amongst them. So really
Brian, I've lost you. Are you still there?
I lost him too.
Oh boy. Well.
one animal eating.
So Brian, if you can hear me, you're breaking up. We've lost you for sort of a whole minute there. How do we want to handle this, Ro?
Do we have a phone that he could maybe call in?
We could try that. I have his slides here. I could share the slides.
Yeah, maybe let's try that. And maybe Brian, what you could do is turn off your camera and see if that helps your bandwidth situation. Maybe if we all turn off our camera, it would help him out too.
Okay, let's do that.
Meanwhile, Scott, do we have a phone that he can call in? And
Yeah, I'm gonna put it in the chat right now.
okay, cool. Considering that he's in Africa. And
Yep.
to our audience members, please be patient. This is, the price of working with international experts from all over the world, right?
Do you see the slides?
Yeah, I can see the slides.
Okay.
I can see slides. I can turn off my camera.
Yeah, that might be. We're seeing it in presenter mode, Mark. Can you maybe make it full screen? Maybe, I think on the top left, you have a button that says use slideshow.
Could we attempt to just me reshare my screen again? I think that having moved might provide a bit of stability on my line.
Sure, we could try that.
Can you give me the power cable, please? Okay. Are we good to continue?
Yes,
Sure.
I see that.
Okay. If I do cut out, please just someone notify me. Okay, so I'm not entirely sure where I lost you, but just as a reminder, a basic food web is any connection of organisms, that is plants and animals, within their environment. And really the interaction, one animal or plant or one animal eating another animal are what we call trophic interactions. And those trophic interactions are really important in biology because they control things like the amount of energy that flows through an ecosystem, the actual structure of that network, and so how that food web looks, but then also the populations of the different animals. And it's really important in dictating things like how they compete with each other and their population dynamics. So it's in that context that myself and my students work on snake biology. This is my student, Selindo Kuchler, eyeing up a snake. And as you can see, he's very contemplative at the moment about what that snake is thinking. And he's probably thinking mostly, what has this snake recently eaten, given what we do? And you're probably all relatively familiar with snakes, but I thought it would be a good point to just come and tell you, really clarify what a snake is, because a lot of people don't really understand the evolutionary history that led to snakes. So what you see over here is a phylogenetic tree. This is this branching diagram here. And what it shows is it's a graphical representation of how closely related animals are to each other. So up on the top over here, you can see that skinks and girdled lizards are really closely related to each other. And then you can see down here that these agamas and chameleons are really closely related to each other. And importantly, what this tells us is that snakes are really just a branch of the lizard evolutionary tree. Now, that means that snakes are really just special lizards, but they are really, really special lizards. They're an amazing group of animals. They account for about just under 4,000 individual species now. They arose evolutionarily about 100 million years ago. And importantly, amongst other things, every single one of those nearly 4,000 species is a predator. There's not a single species of snake that is herbivorous in any context whatsoever. So snakes are really an entire evolutionary branch of about 4,000 species, all of which are predators. Excuse me. So snakes as predators is really a central theme in how people view them. We know that as predators, they can influence ecosystems in important ways, or at least we would think that they can influence ecosystems in important ways. As I've already told you, all species of snakes are predators, and in many of those ecosystems, they can be the most abundant predator in that system. But snakes are also really special, and there are a couple of important ways in which they are special. The first is that from juvenile size up to adult size, they change immensely, far more than a mammal does. But then really one of the things that jumps out at us is the ability of snakes to swallow and digest really huge meals. And this might not sound like a big deal, but many species of snakes are capable of eating meals, single prey items, swallowing them whole, that weigh more than the mass of the actual snake itself. So you can see on the left over here, a picture of a southern African python, and it's in the process of swallowing an antelope that weighs the exact same amount as that snake. So its meal is 100% body mass. To just really let that message settle in, I want you to think about the last meal you had and how much it weighed relative to you. And chances are it was maybe a percentage or two. It's highly unlikely that you would ever be able to eat a meal that was equivalent to like anything over 5 or 6% of your body mass, let alone 100%. Okay. And snakes have been really important as predators, not only because of how they influence their ecosystems, but how they interact with people. And you can see this image of these Agtanagritas from the Philippines with a reticulated python. And this work has shown quite clearly that snakes and humans not only interact with each other as predators, but also reciprocally as prey. And so snakes eat people, people eat snakes. And the really cool thing about this particular paper was it showed that snakes and people also eat the same prey items, pigs and deer in that landscape. So with all of the evidence, or with all of this predator talk in mind, you might think that there is a lot of evidence that shows that snakes can impact ecosystems quite drastically. And amazingly, the answer is that although we think it's really common, it seems as though actual evidence for snakes impacting their ecosystems is relatively rare. And the two examples which I have on screen here are really the only two good examples that we have of evidence for how snakes impact ecosystems. At the top, you see a photograph of a brown tree snake. This is a medium to large size snake that was introduced onto the island of Guam in the 1950s, and since then has taken over and has absolutely decimated the local fauna on the island. And so Guam has had many species of birds go extinct. It's had several populations crash throughout. And we now know that these snakes preying on these birds on the island has also resulted in important changes, not only to which prey animals are left on the island, but even how that island functions ecologically. So for example, we've seen changes in how trees reproduce in the forests because of changes in seed carrying by those island birds that are now missing. So an example of a snake that was introduced to an island and has fundamentally changed the ecosystem there. Kind of a natural experiment. The second one is an example of a large Burmese python. And this photograph was taken in Florida in the southern USA. And Burmese pythons were introduced into Florida a couple of decades ago by accident, and they've done really well in the Everglades. We see that through the 2000s, their populations went through a rapid growth phase. And really what has happened as a result of this is that these pythons have changed the complete makeup of the of the animal communities in those areas. So not ironically, one of the strange things is that the only two examples that we really have for snakes impacting ecosystems is species that have been introduced as sort of natural experiments. We'll come back to snakes and ecosystems shortly. Okay, but it's not the only reason that we need to study diets, the impact of snakes on ecosystems. There are other reasons to study snake diets, and one of those reasons is because of the global snakebite crisis. Now, many of you might be fully aware of this, but others might not. Snake envenomations, it's really difficult to estimate exactly how many deaths there are annually globally, but the World Health Organization estimates that about 140,000 people die every year from snake bites. And just to give you some context for that, if this lecture and discussion is going to take about an hour, during that time, 15 people will die from snake bite, and another 45 or so will be severely injured, disfigured, or end up with disabilities. And so this global snakebite crisis is having a huge impact on people around the world, particularly in tropical areas. This image is from India, but parts of sub-Saharan Africa and of course Latin America are major issues with, or have major issues with envenomation by snakes. Now you might say to me, well, what does that have to do with snake diets? And the answer to that is basically that snake diets mostly evolve in the context, snake venoms mostly evolve in the context of their diet. So I want to point out two examples to you of that really show this quite neatly. The first is a saw-scaled viper. This is a very small viper, so related to things like lanceheads or rattlesnakes in the New World. It occurs throughout parts of Africa and Asia. And these little snakes account for potentially as many as 20,000 fatalities a year. Some of these groups, however, have fairly specialized diets. And what this study did was it looked at at several different species of viper, and they are down here on this bottom axis. And above it, they represent from this Echis group, from this saw-scaled viper group, they represent their diets. And what you notice here is that these three species over here all include relatively large numbers, particularly of scorpions in their diet, but of invertebrates in their diet. Whereas this group over here doesn't include, or it very rarely includes invertebrates in their diet. And what they did was they took venoms from these different snakes and they injected it into various invertebrate organisms to test their effectiveness. And what we found is that the amount, again, not we, this is what the scientists found, was that the amount of venom required from these species to kill an invertebrate model organism was really, really small quantities. But the species that ate very few invertebrates, mostly eating mammals, if you took its venom and injected it into this model organism, it required far vaster quantities to impact it. So really what's happened is that these specialist species over here have evolved to have venoms that are very targeted towards their prey. Another example is from this snake over here. And what we notice from this snake over here, the Spilotes, is that its venom is quite complex. I don't need you to know the details of what's happening on this plot over here, other than to say each of those spikes in the plot correspond to different groups of toxins within its venom. Importantly, if we look at the details of this spike 4 and spike 3, they are toxins by the name of salmotoxin 1 and sulditoxin. And if you take sulditoxin and inject it into lizards, it's highly toxic to them. But if you inject it into small mammals, it has nearly no effect on them. If you take the salmotoxin 1 and inject it into small mammals, it's nearly lethal to them. And if you inject that same salmotoxin into lizards, it does nearly nothing to them. And so what we see here is evolution of venoms with different components that focus on particular prey types within the diet of these animals. Obviously, this is a snake that eats both lizards and small mammals. So we can see that snake venoms vary with diet. And so understanding diet can really help us to better understand how snake venoms evolved, how they function, and potentially how it impacts humans. Excuse me. So today I'm going to touch on 3 short little descriptions of the research that we do in our lab. The one is going to be talking about how we study snake diets. We're going to talk very briefly about how snake diets have evolved and some of the work that we've done to try and understand how snake diets have changed through time. And then we're going to finish by talking about some of our ongoing research about how do snakes impact their ecosystems. So how do we study the diets of snakes? Well, you might be surprised to find that the most common way to study the diets of snakes is to simply go and watch snakes feeding. This is not that easy, and relatively few studies nowadays rely on direct observations of feeding. This is normally because it's quite difficult to see in the wild. It's quite difficult to plan to just go out and see a snake feeding. Most of the work is, as a result, taken place by dissection of museum specimens, but there are also growing other avenues that are growing quite rapidly that are seeming like they might be productive, including stable isotope analysis, the use of DNA, particularly eDNA or DNA from the feces of snakes. There's some direct recording from videography, and then community science or citizen science is really growing. It's that first one that I want to, or that last one rather, that I want to talk to you about first. So before we get onto the community science part, a little note on traditional snake diet sampling. Traditional snake diet sampling normally takes the form of going to a museum collection where there might be snakes that are preserved in jars. And by dissecting out the stomach contents of those animals, we're able to learn quite a lot about their prey. As you can see this figure on the inset on the right, it's a shrew that was extracted from this snake. And the reason I put this particular one up is that for several decades, this was the only known prey type ever to be recorded from the snake species. So this technique has real value, and my own lab has used this. The best example of how we've used these museum specimens is in a study of boomslang diet. Boomslang is an Afrikaans word that means tree snake. It translates directly as tree snake. And boomslang are interesting because they're one of few species of snakes that show differences in color with sex. So in figure A, we have a bright green male, and in figure C, we have a dark black and yellow male. Whereas in figure B and D, we see these drab brown females that can be brown or olive gray. Forget these juveniles at the bottom for now. Importantly, though, we thought, well, one of the reasons that people have thought that these snakes might have different color patterns is that they occupy slightly different niches. perhaps different microhabitats. And so we used these diet data to test if there is a difference between coloration and diet in these snakes, or at least an association between coloration and diet. And using this approach, we were able to show that males and females actually have very, very similar diets. And in fact, that juveniles and adults have very similar diets. And what this really means is that we tested the idea that there might be a difference based on this sexual variation in color pattern, but we found no evidence for it. But it takes a lot of work to go through and get all these museum specimens and look in their stomach contents. And while all of this was going on, myself and a few collaborators started noticing on our own social media feeds, particularly on Facebook, the number of records of photographs that were turning up that people were posting online simply asking, hey, what is this snake that I see? Or hey, what is this, this frog that is being eaten, or anything like that. And so myself and a few collaborators, most importantly my partner, Dr. Robin Ritz, we collated a whole lot of data on this. And we recently published a paper on it that's fairly neat, that really speaks to how social media as a mechanism for community science can help us understand snake diets. So we were able to collect a huge number of records, over 1,000 observations that we collected in a short period of time. This is over a period of a few years. We collected information not only on the prey of reptiles and amphibians, but we also collected information on the predators of reptiles and amphibians. And these are some of the figures from the paper. I just want to highlight two important things to you. This first graph shows the number of feeding records that are available in the literature, in the scientific literature, for snakes in Southern Africa. And you can see that people started collecting records about the early 1900s. That grew quite rapidly till about 2010. And then our Facebook records are the blue records there. And what we were able to show is that we were able to collect as many records in 5 years using social media as took 114 years before that to accumulate. So we were showing that we were collecting records faster than they've ever been collected in history. The other neat finding that came out of the study was that we could find that compared to what was presented in the literature, mostly on the basis of what people dissected out of museum contents, that we were able to identify the prey species to a more accurate or a more precise identification than literature in nearly all cases. And this was mostly because, imagine if you dissect open the stomach of a preserved snake, any contents that are in that stomach have probably been at least partly digested away. And there's a good chance that you lose some of the characteristics of that digested animal that allow you to identify it. Whereas when we get photographs of animals, we can often see those characteristics, and allows us to identify them quite precisely. Okay, so moving on from how people normally study snake diets, I kind of wanted to touch on some of the work we've been doing recently about how snake diets have evolved. When it comes to the question of snake diets evolving, there are really two different questions that you can ask, or at least there are two questions that we're going to ask today. And the first one is, if we think about the evolution of snakes, we could ask the question of, what do we think the evolutionary ancestor of modern snakes ate? And the other thing that we can ask, if we have some of this information, is, how have snake diets changed through time? Now, you might think to yourself, it's one thing to know about what current snakes eat. It's another thing altogether to know about what a species that doesn't exist anymore, but that gave rise to modern snakes ate. And so you might say, well, Brian, how do we do this? And the answer is that there are a few statistical models that allow us to try and make a best guess at what that answer might be. And the two pieces of information that we need is, we need a phylogenetic tree, like this branching diagram that I have over here, that show the relationships between different species of snakes. And I've got each of these dots here as a different species of snake. And then we need some information about what those snakes currently eat. And so I've labeled, of my 6 species here, I've labeled 5 of them as not eating birds, and I've labeled 1 of them as eating birds. And so I'm going to give you a quick example of how the logic behind what happens with these models, so that you can understand the work that we did. If we looked at some of these nodes over here, so for example, this group over here of these two species here, we can see that they're closely related and both of them eat birds. That means that there is some evidence to suggest that the most likely, not absolutely, but the most likely diet that the ancestor of these two species here ate was the same as those two there. So these two are blue, we would expect this one to be blue here, and for that same logic, we would probably expect this one to be blue here. So that's all fine and well, but what happens at the next joint over here, the next ancestor that links this species here to this group over here? Well, we can make some inference, and it turns out as you run these models through it, we can say with a degree of certainty that we don't know for certain what this diet was, but we know that it was probably a blue diet, which means does not eat birds, but there is at least some probability that the ancestor of this group did in fact eat birds. We can continue these models further back through the tree by the same logic, and ultimately, once we've run these models through tens of millions of iterations, we can get some confidence around our best guess about what the diet of this ancestral animal over here would have eaten. In this case here, we see that based on the information that we have, that species probably did not eat birds. Okay, so that was just a quick informal introduction to what is called ancestral state reconstruction. And it tells us that the ancestor of this group probably did not eat bird eggs. And it also tells us that the eating of bird eggs probably evolved along the evolutionary branch that gave rise to this species. Okay, so let's take this example and apply it to a real world situation. And the real world situation that myself and collaborators have decided to work on is this group of snakes here called Leopard snakes. Now, the name Leopard you probably aren't that familiar with, but you're probably really familiar with a lot of these snakes that occur in this group. So for example, all of the sea snakes belong in this group over here. All of the cobras belong in this group over here. If you're from Latin America or the southern parts of the United States, you probably recognize this as one of the coral snakes. They all belong in this group. And then for those of you who know anything about Australia and Australia's venomous snakes, the vast majority of Australia's venomous snakes fit into this group over here. Okay, so they're a great group to work with. They're really diverse. They have lots of different ecologies. They have lots of different body sizes. They range from animals that might be as small as adults at only 300 millimeters, all the way up to things like king cobras that can reach in excess of 4 or 5 meters. Okay. And they're a neat group as well because some of the changes that we know that took place in the group seem to happen more than once, not just once. So for example, we know that sea snakes evolved in this group over here, but we also know that sea kraits evolved down here. So we have two separate evolutionary origins of this movement into the oceans. So if we take our ancestral state reconstructions and we try and, as I showed in that example, try and calculate the condition at the base of the tree, what we find over here is that the ancestor of all leopard snakes almost certainly ate a diet that included other reptiles. There's a little bit of evidence to suggest that they might have also eaten amphibians, but that's not very much support for that idea. Really, what we're confident in is that these animals ate reptiles. And we can look at other points in the phylogenetic tree and see what they look like. So for example, for those of you, again, from Latin America and North America, the coral snakes, we can see that coral snakes and the ancestor of coral snakes probably ate a very similar diet dominated by reptiles, potentially with amphibians, but realistically, we know that they ate reptiles. And we can also see it at a few other positions within this phylogenetic tree. It's the same pattern of high certainty that reptiles are in the diet, low confidence that amphibians are in the diet. What about if we come down to these two sea snakes over here? This is the sea snakes that I told you about, and these are the sea kraits. And as we can see, their diets, the ancestor of their diets are really similar. Again, these are dominated by fish though, and those two have independently shifted from a diet of reptiles to a diet of fish. And then there are some other groups that are also of interest. So for example, king cobras and black mambas belong to this group, 3B, and we see that that's a relatively diverse diet. And the group that I work on quite a lot, cobras in the genus Naya, this is 3C here, we can see high confidence that they include amphibians, mammals, and reptiles, and relatively high confidence that they include birds. And so really, cobras are the example of the species that have become the most generalist in their diet. Okay. We learned two other things. I don't need you to worry about these numbers too much. But all I wanted to tell you is that when we look at these patterns of changes in the evolutionary tree of the leopard snakes, we find that the evolution of a diet that includes bird eggs is more likely to occur on a branch that includes birds already. In other words, along an evolutionary branch that already includes birds, but not the other way around. So in other words, you're more likely to evolve a diet that includes bird eggs if you already eat birds, but if you don't eat birds yet, you're not likely to already include bird eggs. And the same is true for lizards and fish. And so what our research has shown through this ancestral state reconstruction is these one-way dependent shifts that have taken place in the evolution of the group, and they've taken place on multiple occasions. The final pattern that I want to show you, and again, you don't need to worry about the details here, suffice to say that if you look at the body size of the species that do or do not eat certain prey types, for several of the species, these over here in white, we see no difference in body size. But for certain groups, including mammals, amphibians, birds, and bird eggs, the species that eat those prey items are bigger bodied than species that don't eat those prey items. Okay. What this all means together is that we've uncovered a bunch of rules that explain how the diet of leopard snakes has evolved through time. So we've shown that the ancestor of these snakes probably ate a diet of reptiles. We've showed that through time, whenever they've moved to the oceans, their diet has changed to a diet of fish, and I didn't present it, but from a diet of fish, we sometimes see a diet of fish eggs evolving. We see that species that include mammals, birds, and bird eggs in their diet tend to be bigger bodied. So if you got bigger, you included more things, including these birds and mammals. And we only see the inclusion of eggs into the diet after they already include the adults of those things. So simple rules all of a sudden explain this really complex diet that we see across the whole family tree. Okay. The final part that I want to talk to you about is not really research, not research outcome focused, but more ongoing research, and that is understanding how snake predation can impact ecosystem. So this is our study site in South Africa. You can see it's marked on this map over here with an X. This is in the Kalahari region. It's a desert region in the northwestern parts of South Africa. And this Kalahari region is really special. It's arid savanna, and it has a bunch of critters that live here, and I would like to introduce some of them to you. So front and center over here, we have these trees, and these trees include huge thatch structures. And these are the colonial nests of the bird that you see in the top left over here, which is a sociable weaver. It's a small sparrow-sized bird. And they build these huge colonies that can include hundreds of chambers and house up to 700 birds at times for really, really big colonies. And these colonies are really important in the landscape. They're used for things like cheetah and leopards as vantage points and lookout points. In this hot desert sunshine, they're used by larger antelope like this kudu as shade. Research has shown that the lizards that live on the trees are more common on trees that have bird nests than don't. And recent work has even shown that the lizards use the alarm calling of the birds as a cue for them to respond to predators like this pygmy falcon on the left over here. Meanwhile, the pygmy falcons nest in these colonies over here and occasionally eat the birds. And these two other bird species here, this barbet and these finches, they also utilize the colonies to breed in them commensally. And so really what we end up seeing is that these colonies and their size and placement in the landscape influence nearly every aspect of the faunal community around them. But there are also snakes here, and the two snakes that I need to introduce you to here are first the Cape Cobra on the left here. That's this yellow snake. It's the same species that you saw on the cover slide, but from a different population. And on the right over here, we have a boomslang, and I've also introduced you to boomslang before. These are the snakes that we showed that have differences in sex colors, but not differences in diets between the sexes. So these two species inhabit the same landscape, and they're really important for a couple of, well, for one main reason. And the reason is that the single biggest predictor of whether the birds in the sociable weaver colonies are able to breed in a season is predation by the snakes. If conditions are right for snake predation, these birds can attempt to breed throughout an entire summer, and in some summers, not a single egg or chick will survive, because these snakes will come into the colonies, they'll maraud through them, and a single snake, this is a particularly big colony, but in a smallish colony or a medium-sized colony, a single snake can eat every single chick and egg that is laid throughout that entire season, and those birds will not fledge a single bird in the whole year. So the size of the group that lives here and the size of the structure that they build is dictated by predation from these two snakes, Cape cobras and boomslang. So we know that snake predation strongly controls the size of the colonies by eating all of the chicks and eggs. And we also know that the impact that these birds have on their ecosystem is controlled by the size of the colony. So a collaborator from UCT has shown that the diversity of animals that use these colonies increases as colony size increases. And so if the colonies grow more, they're utilized by more animals. If the snakes stop the colonies from growing, the colonies eventually, parts of them break off, and ultimately you get a smaller colony with less utilization by animals. And so we think predation pressure from snakes controls colony growth rate, and therefore that it's in fact the snakes that are regulating what's happening indirectly in that ecosystem. Now, we don't have any data to show that yet, but we have done diet studies on these two snakes, and it's starting to provide us some real insights into what is going on in this ecosystem. So let's look at those. Okay, the figure that I've presented to you here is a bar chart, and on the bottom are different animals. This is an amphibian, a tortoise, a lizard represented by a chameleon, snakes, birds, bird eggs, and small mammals. And what you see, each of the different colored bar charts represent the diets of the different species. So boomslang is represented by the orange, Cape cobras are represented by the blue. Now, the higher the bar, the greater the importance of that prey type to those snakes. And so let's see what this actually tells us. One of the things that you should pay attention to is the fact that the dietary evenness of the cobra diet means that they're real generalists and they consume prey from a huge number of different groups, okay? It means that if one of the prey types that they're consuming becomes scarce or has a crash in population, they can easily switch to another, and it means that they're not really dependent on any one thing. Boomslang, as you can see, by contrast, eat a lot of birds and they eat a lot of lizards, and particularly chameleons. And one of the things that's really important to know about the system is that although chameleons are present, they are really scarce in the system. And that means that boomslang at this particular study site have a diet that is almost entirely dominated by birds and their eggs. Okay, what this means is that the boomslang in the ecosystem are really, really dependent on what's happening with the laying of eggs by those sociable weavers. And if you see prolonged droughts, which we've seen in the past, in which the birds don't lay lots of eggs or don't produce lots of chicks, then the boomslang really takes strain. And we've found snakes that are just skin and bones because there's no bird breeding taking place. At that same time, cobras are able to continue eating other prey items. Okay, then there's other important things to know. The one is competition between the snakes is really interesting because it turns out that cobras, as you can see over here by the blue, eat a lot of other snakes. That means that they have the ability, when they're competing with boomslang for resources like these weavers, really there's an extra level of complexity to that competition, because not only can the Cape cobras compete with the boomslang for their food, but should a Cape cobra encounter a boomslang, it can eat the boomslang. Okay, so that really reveals an interesting ecological interaction in the system. And then the last complexity that came out of it is that it turns out that Cape cobras, and in fact cobras in general, are really quite frequently cannibalistic. So what you can see over here, this is a Cape Cobra from our study system. This is a large adult male, and coming out of his mouth, or rather going into his mouth, is the body of a slightly smaller male at the study site. Okay. And when we started studying cannibalism, we thought that initially it was probably going to be quite a rare event to take place. But it turns out that Cape Cobras are really common in the diet of Cape Cobras, and they make up about 5% of all prey records, meaning that it's not an insignificant quantity of their meals are actually other Cape Cobras. And so our dietary studies have revealed yet another complexity that needs to be put into the diagram in terms of how we understand the evolution of, or at least the functioning of this ecosystem. So, in summary, the details of snakes' diets are important, at least to people like me. There are new approaches to gathering diet information, and they could really be game changers. By using snake diet data, we can show that changes in snake diets can be explained by only a few factors, actually. And so it's helping us to understand the origins of diversity of life on Earth. And ultimately, basic dietary studies help us to understand what snakes do in their ecosystems. That's all I want to tell you for now. I need to thank all of these people listed over here, particularly Dr. Robin Moritz and a bunch of my grad students who are listed underneath there. And with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Great, Brian. Thank you so much. That was a really great talk. I learned quite a lot about what you do. So while we wait for some questions to come up in the chat, I have a couple that I'd be interested in asking you. So the first is sort of more of a personal thing. So can you tell me kind of what got you interested in studying snakes in the first place?
Sure. I've always been interested in biology, and animals in general, zoology in general. I went to university initially studying molecular biology and genetics, but quite quickly realized that my interest, as an undergrad, realized that my interests lay in zoology, in whole organism biology. And it was a fortuitous interaction with a professor who gave a talk saying, he was explaining how snakes are great models for studying ecophysiology. And I remember leaving the lecture and thinking to myself, you could study snakes as a career. That could be a thing. And it just grew from there into an obsession and then ultimately a career.
So if someone in the audience was interested in getting into this kind of stuff, how would that work?
All of the work that I do really links straight from a university undergraduate and then graduate program. So the kind of research that we do is the kind of stuff that you might do at a grad school. My recommendation would be pursue a degree in biology, and then if it's still what you're into, continue on to graduate school. If that's not on the horizon for whatever reason, there are a number of other ways of getting involved in herpetology more casually, and a quick search for some of the herpetological societies will quickly reveal links and access to resources that are available, for learning more, but also even for participating in crowdsourcing elements of projects. And then also most communities have at least one crazy snake person, some of which are even nice people, and you can go and it's often good to reach out to those communities and chat a little bit about biology, and it often opportunities stem from there.
Okay, so there's a question in the chat. Can the diets of snakes tell how long the species has existed? And maybe if not, how would you tell how long it's existed?
So we don't use the diets of snakes to tell how long different species of snakes have likely existed, or at least when they last shared a common ancestor with their closest relatives. We use DNA data to do that, obviously, and scientists use a combination of tools to estimate how many changes have taken place in an organism's DNA through time. And they normally combine those models with fossils. And so if they have a particular fossil that they know shows a particular characteristic, and that fossil is dated to a piece of geology of a particular age, you can use that to try and calibrate your understanding of how old these different branches are. Diet data is not really good for this. There's quite a lot of flexibility in diet data, so it can change from species to species relatively quickly. And unlike the DNA data, it can change in really, what's the word I'm looking for? Case-by-case basis. So it's not like a DNA change that is predicted to change in a particular order at a set rate through time.
So then I had a technical question. You showed a big tree of snakes, the elapids, yeah. And the tree seemed a little funny shaped to me. So the kind of one side was very short and the other side just kept branching and branching and branching. And I was curious as to how that might happen.
So that diagram I kind of glossed over it. That tree doesn't necessarily show, those branch lengths don't necessarily relate to how old those different species are. But you did notice, or what you might not have noticed, is that some of those branches give rise to like one lineage or two lineages, and then others give rise to hundreds. A lot of that is driven by what happened in Australia. So basically the top half of that tree is the result of snakes getting to Australia and then just diversifying into a huge number of different ecological niches. And we think that this is because there were no other competitors there at the time. And so this rapid, what they call an evolutionary radiation of species, resulted in lots and lots and lots of branches and diversity in that part of the tree, whereas some of the other lineages, they've remained relatively species poor through time.
Oh, I see. And then, okay, maybe we have time for one more question then. Or let's see.
Can I maybe ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sure.
All right. Sorry, I had my hand raised. Let me lower it. So I was interested about the cannibalism in the Cape Cobras. I mean, it's pretty neat. Is that common? I guess, do we have a sense of how common that is in snake species, and even like in the animal kingdom broadly? Like I don't have a good sense of how common cannibalism is. Can you say something about that?
Sure. So cannibalism doesn't tend to be that common across all animals, mostly because there are benefits to being a cannibal, believe it or not, but there are also quite a lot of setbacks or negative elements to it. It seems to have evolved really quite frequently in certain groups of snakes. And part of that has to do with the fact that we think that snakes, another snake is a really good shaped meal for a snake. And so there's a relatively high propensity for eating other snakes by snakes, because ultimately you're a long tube with a hole at one end, and it's quite easy, or the best shaped meal to put back in or put into that long tube is another tube, rather than like a big bally kitten or something. And so it's quite common in snakes for them to eat other snakes. There are certain lineages of snakes that do it as specialists. So king cobra is famous for it. The actual genus name for king cobra is Ophiophagus, means snake eater. And then there are a couple of other examples from around the world. King snakes in the US are given that name because they relatively frequently eat rattlesnakes. But interestingly, they're not very frequently cannibals. It seems to be that cannibalism is really common in cobras, and we think it's disproportionately common in cobras because it might have stemmed from the advantages gained from eating a competitor, either a competitor for mates or a competitor for resources. But it seems as though it's only males that eat other males, as far as we can tell. And part of the complexity is that when these snakes, when two male cobras compete over a female, we know that there's biting involved. And so the expectation is that this is a behavior that has grown from biting and ultimately gone into, well, I can compete with this male for a resource or a female, or I can eat him. That way I get the resource and I get this huge meal. So it does seem disproportionately common in cobras. But there are a few other lineages, but on average, it's not exceedingly common throughout the animal kingdom.
Wait, so is the idea that we think it evolved because people they would bite each other and they're like, hey, that tastes pretty good, might as well just eat the rest?
We think, and it's very much a guess at this stage, but we think that the males biting each other in combat was sort of a behavioral precursor that eventually allowed the opportunity for those consumptions to take place. It's based on the fact that we tend to only find males as cannibals and male snakes inside of them, but our sample sizes are relatively small for this.
Have you thought about writing a book titled The Benefits of Cannibalism?
I have not thought about that. So I mean, ecologically, the benefits of cannibalism are ridiculously good. The big downside is that you run a huge risk of parasite transfer. That seems to be the big drawback to it.
Okay.
Or eating your offspring, yes.
Yeah. Also doesn't seem beneficial, eating your offspring.
No, would be bad.
Okay.
So maybe I'll take the last question then. So you showed that evolutionarily snakes will first evolve to eat the adult and then later evolve to eat the egg. But this seems sort of counterintuitive to me. Is there a reason why this happens?
The thinking around it at the moment is that the first thing that happens is that the adults start getting consumed because the snake is in a particular habitat. They're interacting and they're starting to cue in on those scent cues that they get from the organism. And it seems as though they need to be in the right places to find those organisms rather than just randomly finding the eggs lying around in the landscape. And so it seems as though they either need to start cueing in on the smell of birds before they start eating bird eggs, or the smell perhaps of reptiles before they start eating reptile eggs, or alternatively, they start cueing in on particular species that they feed on. And as a result, they start feeding in very precise microhabitats where those animals are laying their eggs.
Nice. Okay. Wow. Wow, I really learned a lot today. Thank you so much for giving the talk. I think I personally really appreciated it. I'm sure all the attendees appreciated it. And I wish you enjoyable the rest of your day.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great day. If anyone needs any further information about snakes or is curious about anything, they can check out our website for our lab at maritzlab.com. Or alternatively, drop me an email. I'm happy to answer questions.
Right. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Mark. Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.